The ink hit her dress like a slap. Thalassa watched the black stain spread across the grey wool, the only clean thing she owned, as Professor Graves lifted his silver-headed cane from the mahogany table. The impact had sent a spray of gall ink across her lap, across the manuscript she'd been copying for 16 hours straight, across the stone floor of the basement scriptorium, where the gas lights hissed and sputtered in their brackets. The Empire waits for no one. Graves tapped the cane against the table leg. Once. Twice. Like a clock counting down. If you sleep, you are a parasite. Right. Her fingers were raw. The pads of her thumbs had split open hours ago. The constant friction of parchment and quill leaving her skin cracked and weeping. She didn't look up at him. She wiped the ink from her thumb onto the already ruined fabric of her shawl and reached for a fresh sheet. The room grew cold, not the damp cold of the basement, where moisture beaded on the stone walls and her breath had been visible all winter. This was different. Sharper. The kind of cold that made her lungs ache when she inhaled. The gas lights flickered, their yellow flames turning pale, almost violet, and frost began to creep across the surface of the inkwell. Graves didn't notice. He was lighting his pipe, the tobacco smoke curling up toward the low ceiling, and when he exhaled, he aimed the cloud directly at her face. "Look at you." His laugh was wet, phlegmy. "A broken tool and a pretty shawl. You're not worth the wax in these candles." Thalassa's hand trembled as she dipped the quill. The nib scraped against parchment. She'd been awake for 2 days. Maybe 3. Time had stopped meaning anything except the intervals between Graves checking his gold pocket watch, counting down her remaining work hours, deciding whether she'd earn the right to collapse on the thin mattress upstairs, or whether she'd spend another night hunched over this desk. Her vision blurred. The letters swam. "Pathetic," Graves muttered. The gas lights went out. All of them. Simultaneously. The basement plunged into absolute darkness, and Thalassa's breath caught in her throat, because the cold intensified, became a physical presence pressing against her skin, and she heard nothing. No footsteps. No creak of floorboards. But she felt the air shift, felt something massive and ancient move through the space where Graves had been standing. And when the lights flickered back to life, they burned that strange violet color. And there was a man in the room who hadn't been there before. He stood in the corner, motionless, wearing a velvet greatcoat so black it seemed to absorb the light around it, making the gas flames dim and struggle in their brackets. His face was pale, so sharp-featured, beautiful in the way that broken glass is beautiful. Something that would cut you if you touched it. Graves spun around. Who the devil? Silence? The word wasn't loud, but it hit like a physical force, and Graves's mouth snapped shut, his pipe clattering to the floor. Thalassa watched the stranger move forward, each step perfectly silent, and she saw the ring on his left hand, a signet made from a single shard of something black and frozen, like crystallized blood. He stopped at the table, looked down at her ruined dress, her bleeding fingers, the manuscript she'd been copying. Then he reached out and touched the lumina stone that sat on Graves's desk, the enchanted crystal that provided light for night work. It cracked. A sharp, clean sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The stone split down the middle, its inner light guttering and dying. And the stranger, Valerius, though she didn't know his name yet, turned his attention to Graves. "Your light is an offense to the night." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "She is coming with me." Graves found his voice. "You can't. She's contracted. I own her time." "You own nothing." Valerius moved faster than Thalassa's eyes could follow. One moment he was standing by the table. The next, he was directly in front of Graves, so close their faces nearly touched, and the temperature in the room dropped so sharply that Thalassa's next breath came out as a white cloud of vapor. "The girl's heart is racing," Valerius said. "I can hear it from across the room. Do you know why?" Graves tried to step back. Couldn't. His legs wouldn't move. "She's afraid," Valerius continued, "that you'll take away her mattress, that you'll add another hour into her shift, that you'll find some new way to remind her she's worthless." He tilted his head, studying Graves like a specimen pinned to a board. "You've stolen her sleep, stolen her dignity, stolen her belief that tomorrow might be different from today." I pay her." "You pay her in exhaustion and contempt." Valerius lifted his hand. The signet ring caught the violet light. "The man who stole her sleep will be gifted with a vigil that lasts until his mind shatters. You will not sleep, Professor. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until you understand what you've done." He touched Graves's forehead with one finger. Graves screamed. It was a sound Thalassa had never heard a human make before. High and thin and utterly terrified. And then he collapsed, his custom-tailored frock coat crumpling as he hit the floor, his silver-headed cane rolling away across the stones. His eyes were open, wide open, staring at nothing. Valerius turned to her. "Come," he said. Thalassa stood. Her legs shook. Her vision swam. But she clutched her frayed shawl around her shoulders and stepped away from the desk, away from the manuscript, away from the man who'd counted her worth in candle wax and work hours. Valerius extended his hand. She took it. His skin was cold. Not corpse cold, but winter cold. The kind that burned if you held on too long. He led her toward the stairs, and behind them, Graves began to whimper, a broken animal sound, and Thalassa realized he was trying to close his eyes and couldn't. The luminous stone cracked again, louder this time, and in the darkness that followed, she heard Valerius whisper, "Justice will be absolute." The carriage moved through streets she didn't recognize. Thalassa pressed her forehead against the window glass, watching the Cid blur past in streaks of amber gaslight and shadow. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed, ink-stained, wearing a dress that looked like someone had thrown it into a gutter. The velvet seat beneath her was softer than anything she'd touched in years. It made her spine ache worse somehow, like her body was remembering what comfort felt like and rejecting it. Valerius sat across from her, silent. His coat absorbed the dim light from the carriage lamps, making the space feel smaller, darker. She could hear her own breathing, could hear the wheels grinding over cobblestones, could hear nothing from him at all. No breath, no heartbeat, no rustle of fabric when he moved. "Where are we going?" Her voice cracked. She hadn't spoken to anyone except Graves in months. "Home." The word hung in the air between them like frost. The carriage stopped. Thalassa looked out the window and saw iron gates taller than any building she'd ever worked in. their bars twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Angles that shouldn't exist. Curves that seemed to fold back on themselves. Beyond them, a mansion rose from the darkness, like something carved from midnight itself. No lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimneys, just stone and shadow and the sense that the building had been standing there since before the city existed. Valerius opened the door, extended his hand again. She took it, stepped down onto gravel that crunched beneath her worn shoes. The air here was different, cleaner, colder, tasting of pine and snow even though it was spring in the rest of the city. Her breath came out white. The gates opened without anyone touching them. Inside, the entrance hall stretched upward into darkness so complete she couldn't see the ceiling. Marble floors reflected nothing. The walls were lined with portraits of people who all had Valerius's sharp features, his pale skin, his eyes that caught light like a cat's. Candles burned in silver sconces, their flames perfectly still despite the draft she could feel against her skin. Thalassa's legs gave out. She caught herself against a table. Real mahogany, not the cheap pine Graves had painted to look expensive. And her vision swam. When was the last time she'd eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Time had stopped meaning anything except the intervals between one manuscript and the next. Sit. She looked up. Valerius was pointing to a chair upholstered in fabric so dark it looked wet. She stumbled toward it, collapsed into cushions that seemed to wrap around her like hands, and her body made a sound she didn't recognize. Something between a gasp and a sob. I should... She tried to stand. Couldn't. I should work. You brought me here to work, didn't you? I can copy manuscripts. I'm fast. I'm accurate. I just need a desk and ink and... No. Valerius moved closer. She hadn't seen him cross the room. One moment he was by the door. The next, he was kneeling in front of her chair, eye level, close enough that she could see her reflection in his pupils. You will not work tonight, he said. You will not work tomorrow. You will not work until your hands have healed and your spine has straightened and you remember what it feels like to wake without pain. But silence. The word was gentle this time, almost kind. He reached out and took her right hand in both of his, turning it palm up, studying the split skin and permanent ink stains like they were something precious. His touch was cold enough to sting. These hands, he said quietly, have created beauty for a man who couldn't see it. They've worked through exhaustion that would have killed someone weaker. They've bled for someone else's profit. He looked up at her. They will not bleed again. Not here. Thalassa's throat closed. She tried to speak. Couldn't. Valerius stood. Come. He led her through corridors that seemed to shift and breathe, past rooms filled with books that smelled of leather and time. Up a staircase that spiraled higher than should have been possible, given the mansion's external dimensions. Her legs shook with every step. Her vision kept blurring at the edges. But his hand on her elbow was steady, guiding her forward, and she followed because she didn't know what else to do. They stopped at a door carved from wood so dark it looked like solidified smoke. Valerius opened it. The room beyond was smaller than she'd expected. A bed dominated the space. Four-poster, draped in silk, the color of deep water, piled with pillows that looked like they'd swallow her whole. A fireplace burned with flames that gave off no smoke. A window looked out over gardens she couldn't quite see, their shapes moving in ways that didn't match the wind. "This is yours," Valerius said. Thalassa stared at the bed, at the silk, at the pillows. Her fingers twitched, reaching for a quill that wasn't there, searching for work that didn't exist. "I haven't earned this." The words came out automatically, Graves's voice echoing in her skull. "I haven't done anything to deserve—" "Stop." Valerius stepped in front of her, blocking her view of the room, forcing her to look at him instead of the bed she couldn't let herself want. "In my kingdom," he said, each word precise and cold, "rest is not earned. It is not a reward for productivity. It is not something you must purchase with blood and exhaustion." He touched her chin, tilted her face up. "It is a right. Sleep." "I can't." "You will." He guided her toward the bed. She moved like a puppet, her body obeying even as her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she'd wake up back in the basement with Graves standing over her, that this was a dream or a trap or some new kind of torture. The mattress gave beneath her weight like water. The pillows cradled her head. The silk sheets slid against her ruined dress, cool and smooth, and her body made that sound again, the gasped sob that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I've forgotten how to sleep." Valerius sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress didn't shift beneath him. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his fingers leaving trails of cold against her skin. "Then I will teach you." He began to hum. It wasn't a melody. Not exactly. It was a sound like the ocean in a deep cave, like wind through ancient trees, like the earth settling after a storm. It vibrated in her chest, in her bones, in the base of her skull. The tension in her shoulders, tension she'd carried for so long she'd stopped noticing it, began to dissolve. Her eyes grew heavy. "No," she mumbled, fighting it. "I have to. There's work. Graves will never touch you again." The humming continued, deeper now, resonant. The sound wrapped around her like the silk sheets, like the darkness beyond the window, like something vast and protective that had been waiting centuries for her to arrive. Thalassa's eyes closed. The last thing she felt was Valerius's hand resting on her forehead, cold as winter, gentle as snow, and the tension in her spine, the knot of fear and exhaustion that had lived there for years, finally snapped and dissolved into nothing. She slept, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she dreamed of a basement where the gas lights had gone out forever, where Graves sat on the floor with his eyes forced open, counting the hours until his mind shattered, while frost crept across the walls and turned his precious manuscripts to ash. The sound came first. Not footsteps, not voices. Glass shattering. Dozens of windows exploding inwards simultaneously. The crash so loud, Thalassa jolted upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs before her mind caught up to her body. Light flooded the room, not the gentle amber of gas lamps or the violet glow of Valerius's candles. This was white, blinding, hostile. It burned through her eyelids even when she squeezed them shut, turned the darkness behind them red and raw. She threw her arm across her face, gasping, and felt the silk sheets slide away as she scrambled backward against the headboard. The temperature spiked. The cold that had wrapped around her like a blanket since she'd entered this place evaporated in seconds, replaced by dry heat that made her throat close. Magnesium flares. She recognized the chemical smell from the university laboratories, the acrid smoke that made her eyes water. Someone was burning them throughout the mansion, flooding every shadow with noon-bright illumination that left nowhere to hide. Valerius! Her voice cracked. She couldn't see. The light was too much, too sudden after days of gentle darkness. She pressed her palms against her eyes and felt tears streaming between her fingers. No answer. Thalassa forced herself to move, slid off the bed, her legs shaking, her bare feet hitting carpet that felt wrong now. Too warm, too exposed. She stumbled toward where she remembered the door being, one hand outstretched, the other still shielding her face from the merciless glare. Her fingers found wood, found the handle. She pulled. The corridor beyond was worse. Every sconce blazed with magnesium fire. Every shadow had been burned away, leaving only harsh angles and exposed stone. The portraits on the walls looked different in this light. Not mysterious and ancient, but faded and peeling. Their subjects' eyes following her with what looked like accusation. Footsteps, heavy boots on marble. "Search every room." The voice echoed up from the entrance hall. Not Valerius, someone else. Someone whose tone made her stomach drop, because she'd heard that particular brand of entitled authority before. The creature can't have gone far. Not in this light. Thalassa pressed herself against the wall. Her dress, the clean one Valerius had left folded on a chair while she slept, felt too bright now, too visible. She was a grey smudge against dark stone, and the men below were hunting. She moved toward the stairs. Each step felt like walking into a furnace. The flares had turned the mansion into a kiln, baking away the protective cold, the merciful darkness, everything that had made this place feel safe. At the top of the staircase, she stopped. Graves stood in the entrance hall. He wore his custom-tailored frock coat, the one with silk lapels that caught the light. His silver-headed cane rested against his shoulder like a raw rifle. Behind him, 6 men in leather aprons carried more flares, their faces wrapped in cloth against the smoke, their eyes hidden behind tinted goggles. Exterminators. Thalassa's breath caught. She'd seen them before, hired by wealthy families to clear out nests of rats or colonies of bats. They worked with fire and poison and brutal efficiency. They didn't ask questions, they just burned. Graves looked up, saw her. His smile was worse than his anger had ever been. "There you are." He tapped the cane against the marble floor. Once. Twice. The sound echoed like a countdown. "Did you think you could hide from your obligations? Did you think some parlor trick with the lights would erase your debt?" Thalassa couldn't move. Her legs had locked. She watched Graves ascend the stairs, each step measured and deliberate. His gold pocket watch swinging from its chain. "You belong to me," he said. "By contract, by law, by the money I invested in your worthless education." He reached the top step, stood close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Where is the creature who took you?" "I don't lie." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron. "The thing that calls itself Valerius. The parasite that's been stealing servants and scribes for decades. Where does it hide when the sun comes calling? She tried to pull away. Couldn't. His fingers dug into the soft skin above her pulse, grinding bone against bone. I have a contract. Graves pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, shook it open with his free hand. The parchment was covered in her own handwriting, her signature at the bottom in ink that looked like dried blood. 5 years of service in exchange for room and board. You've completed 8 months. You owe me 52 more. You starved me. The words came out before she could stop them. You worked me until my hands bled. I provided opportunity. His voice was calm, reasonable. The tone he used in lectures when explaining why certain students didn't deserve to pass. You were nothing when I found you. A girl with mediocre penmanship and delusions of scholarship. I gave you purpose. He twisted her wrist. She gasped. Return with me now, Graves said, or I burn this tomb to the ground. Every room, every shadow, every corner where that thing might be cowering. He gestured to the exterminators below. They're very good at their work, very thorough. Thalassa looked past him, down into the entrance hall, where the men were already moving. Their flares held high, their boots tracking soot across marble that had been pristine hours ago. One of them kicked open a door. White light flooded into what had been a library, and she heard books ignite, their pages curling and blackening in the chemical heat. Stop. Her voice was barely a whisper. Please, don't. Then come. Graves pulled her forward. She stumbled, her bare feet sliding on the stone, and he dragged her down the stairs like she weighed nothing. Her shoulder hit the banister. Pain shot through her collarbone. She tried to find her footing, tried to resist, but his grip was relentless and her body was still weak from years of exhaustion. They reached the entrance hall. The exterminators closed in, forming a circle, their flares held at chest height. The heat was unbearable. Thalassa's vision swam. Bind her, Graves said. One of the men stepped forward, pulled a length of rope from his belt, reached for her arms. Her sleeve rode up. The mark was small, barely visible. A symbol etched into the pale skin of her inner forearm in lines so fine they looked like they'd been drawn with a single hair. She'd never seen it before. Hadn't known it was Thernite. But in the harsh magnesium light, it stood out like a brand. A circle. A key. A lock that had been opened. The seal of the silent archive. Graves went still. His eyes locked onto the mark. His face drained of color, then flushed red, then went pale again. You stole it. His voice was barely audible. You didn't just transcribe the scroll, you ingested it. He yanked her arm higher, forcing her onto her toes, his fingers digging into the mark until she cried out. One of the exterminators stepped closer, holding a lantern. Its beam focused on her skin like an accusation. Do you know what this is? Graves's voice was shaking now. Not with fear, with rage. Do you have any concept of what you've done? Thalassa shook her head. Couldn't speak. The pain in her arm was blinding. The silent archive. Graves pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. The collection of forbidden knowledge that the Empire spent 3 centuries trying to destroy. Texts that could topple governments. Spells that could unmake reality. Secrets that were supposed to die with the last archivists. He twisted her arm. And you absorbed one. I don't know what. Liar! He shoved her backward. She hit the floor, her palms scraping against marble. You're not just a thief. You're a weapon. An uncontrolled, untrained weapon walking around with information that could start wars. He turned to the exterminators. New plan. We're not just retrieving stolen property. We're containing a threat to imperial security. One of the men pulled out iron shackles. Another produced a leather hood, the kind used to transport prisoners to the deep cells beneath the university. Thalassa tried to crawl backward, but hands grabbed her shoulders, her wrists, lifting her like she was cargo. The creature that took you, Graves said, his voice cold now, controlled, gave you something it shouldn't have, made you something dangerous. He picked up his cane, tapped it against the floor. You're coming back to the university, to the containment wing, where we can study what you've become. The shackles closed around her wrists. The hood came down over her head, plunging her into darkness that smelled of old sweat and fear. She heard Graves's voice, muffled now, giving orders. Heard the exterminators responding. Heard the crackle of more flares being lit, more rooms being flooded with hostile light. Hands dragged her forward. She stumbled, blind. Her bare feet sliding on marble that had gone from cold sanctuary to burning trap. The mark on her arm throbbed like a second heartbeat, pulsing in rhythm with something she couldn't name. Behind her, she heard glass shatter. Heard wood splinter. Heard Graves laugh, that wet, phlegmy sound that meant he'd won. The mansion was burning. Valerius was gone. And she was being dragged back into the basement, back into the endless copying and the bleeding fingers and the gas lights that hissed like snakes. But this time, Graves wasn't just taking her labor. He was taking whatever the mark meant, whatever she'd become without knowing it. The hood tightened. The shackles bit into her wrists, and through the leather, through the smoke and chemical heat, she heard Graves's final words. Lock her in the deep archive. No light, no visitors. We'll see what secrets she's hiding. The hood was ripped away. Thalassa gasped, salt air flooding her lungs. Not the chemical burn of magnesium. Not the stale basement damp. Ocean wind, cold and clean, carrying the taste of brine and freedom. She blinked against the sudden grey light. Dawn, or dusk. The sky was the colour of old pewter, heavy with clouds that moved too fast, and beneath her feet, grass, wild grass that bent in the wind, growing from soil that smelled of chalk and ancient stone. The Dover cliffs, she'd seen them once, years ago, before Graves. White limestone dropping straight down into churning water, the edge of England, where the land simply stopped and the sea began. The exterminators had dragged her here in the wagon, still shackled, still hooded. And now they stood in a rough circle around her, their flares extinguished, but their faces hard. Graves stood at the cliff's edge, his coat whipped in the wind. His cane was planted in the soil like a flag. He held the luminous stone in his left hand, the cracked crystal pulsing with weak yellow light that barely competed with the dawn. This is where it ends, he said. His voice carried over the wind, where creatures of shadow meet the sun and burn Sheol. Thalassa tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't hold. She collapsed onto the grass, her shackled hands catching her weight, and felt the mark on her forearm throb in time with her pulse. The thing that took you, Graves continued, turning to face her, cannot follow here. cannot manifest in open air under open sky. He lifted the stone higher. Light is truth. Darkness is deception. And you, girl, are evidence of what happens when we let monsters play at civilization. The wind stopped. Completely. Instantly. The grass went still. The clouds overhead froze mid-motion. Even the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below cut off, leaving only silence so absolute it made Thalassa's ears ring. The temperature dropped. Not gradually. All at once. Her breath came out white. Frost spread across the grass in a perfect circle, radiating outward from a point directly behind Graves. And the exterminators stumbled backward, their hands reaching for weapons they'd left in the wagon. The sea spray rose. It climbed the cliff face like something alive, defying gravity, pulling itself upward in a column of salt water and foam that twisted and condensed and became solid, became a shape, became a man wearing darkness like a second skin. Valerius stood on the cliff's edge. Not the gentleman from the mansion, not the careful, controlled figure who'd hummed her to sleep. This was something older, something vast compressed into human form. His coat didn't move in the wind because there was no wind. The air itself had stopped, held frozen in his presence. His eyes caught the weak dawn light and reflected nothing. Graves spun around. The stone fell from his hand. Impossible. His voice cracked. You can't. The sun, Valerius said. Each word precise and cold as breaking ice, has not yet risen. He moved forward. One step. The grass beneath his feet turned black, the blades crystallizing and shattering into powder. The exterminators ran. Thalassa heard their boots pounding away across the cliff top, heard them shouting to each other in voices tight with panic. But she couldn't look away from Valerius's face. He was smiling. Not with pleasure, not with cruelty, with the absolute certainty of an avalanche. Graves grabbed for the stone. His fingers closed around it, and he thrust it forward like a talisman, like a weapon, the yellow light flaring brighter in his grip. Back! Spittle flew from his lips. I know what you are. I know the old laws. Light burns your kind too. Valerius inhaled. The light moved. Not dimmed. Moved. It streamed from the crystal toward his open mouth, a ribbon of yellow luminescence that he drew in like breath, and the stone in Graves's hand went dark, dead. Just cracked quartz, with no more power than a river rock. Graves made a sound like a wounded animal. He dropped the stone, tried to run. His legs tangled in his coat, and he fell, his cane clattering away across the frozen grass, and Valerius was there, kneeling beside him, one hand pressed flat against the limestone beneath them. You loved light, Valerius said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. Loved it as a weapon, as proof of your superiority, as a tool to burn away anything that dared exist in shadow. Please. Graves was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his custom-tailored coat covered in frost. Please, I'll release her contract. I'll forget the debt. You will have what you gave her. Valerius placed his other hand over Graves's eyes. The professor screamed. It was a sound that made Thalassa's stomach turn, high and broken and utterly terrified. Graves thrashed, his hands clawing at Valerius's wrist. But he might as well have been trying to move a mountain. The vampire held him still, his palm pressed against Graves's face, and spoke in a voice that carried across the frozen cliff top like a judge pronouncing sentence. You stole her rest, stole her dignity, stole her belief that mercy existed in this world. His fingers tightened. You shall have eternal noon, a sun that never sets, light that never dims, every moment of every day, burning behind your eyes until you forget what darkness feels like. He removed his hand. Graves collapsed. His eyes were open, wide open, staring at nothing. But his pupils had contracted to pinpoints, and his face was twisted in agony, and he was screaming about the brightness, about the burning, about the sun that was eating through his skull even though dawn hadn't broken yet. Valerius stood, turned to Thalassa. Can you walk? She nodded. Couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. He crossed to her in 2 strides, knelt, and the shackles on her wrists simply fell away. Not unlocked. Dissolved. The iron turned to rust and powder in seconds, leaving her skin unmarked. The mark, she whispered, looking at her forearm. Graves said I stole... You stole nothing. Valerius touched the symbol with 1 finger. The silent archive chose you. Recognized something in you worth preserving, worth protecting. He met her eyes. You are not a weapon. You are a keeper of knowledge that the Empire tried to destroy, because it feared what it could not control. Behind them, Graves was crawling toward the cliff edge, still screaming. His hands pressed against his face. Will he... Thalassa couldn't finish the question. He will live. Valerius's voice was flat, final. He will live with the light he loved so much. Every waking moment, every dream, until he understands what he did to you. He offered his hand. She took it. Let him pull her to her feet. Her legs shook, but his grip was steady. And when she looked back at Graves, at the man who'd counted her worth in candle wax and work hours, she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just emptiness, where his voice had lived in her head for so long. Come, Valerius said. The carriage was waiting at the top of the cliff path. Not the one from before. This was simpler, darker. A box of shadow on wheels that the dawn light seemed to slide around rather than touch. He helped her inside, and the moment the door closed, warmth flooded back into her limbs. The horses moved without anyone driving them. Thalassa pressed her face against the window, watching the cliffs recede, watching Graves become a small figure curled on the grass, his screams fading into the distance. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and she wondered if he could see it, if the curse showed him this dawn or some other, brighter, more terrible version that existed only behind his eye. Sleep, Valerius said. She looked at him. He sat across from her, perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. The signet ring caught the dawn light filtering through the window, throwing fractured shadows across the carriage interior. I don't know if I can, she admitted. After everything, then I will teach you again. He began to hum. That same sound from before. Ocean in caves. Wind through ancient trees. Earth settling after storms. It wrapped around her like the silk sheets, like the darkness she'd learned to trust. And her eyes grew heavy despite the sunlight, despite the memory of Graves's screams, despite everything. The carriage rolled on. When she woke, they were home. The mansion rose before them, its windows dark again, its shadows restored. The magnesium burns were gone. The shattered glass had been replaced. It looked exactly as it had the first night, as if the invasion had never happened, as if Graves and his exterminators had been nothing more than a bad dream. Valerius carried her inside. She didn't protest, didn't have the strength. He climbed the spiral staircase with her cradled against his chest, his coat soft against her cheek, and she felt his heartbeat, slow, steady, ancient, keeping time with something deeper than blood. The room was the bed, the fireplace, the window looking out over gardens that moved in ways that didn't match the wind. He laid her down on silk that felt like water. "Rest," he said. "Will you stay?" The question came out small, childish. But she needed to know. Valerius moved to the window, stood with his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the grey morning light. A sentinel, a guardian, something that had stood watch for centuries and would stand for centuries more. "Always," he said. Thalassa's eyes closed. The tension in her spine, the last remnant of Graves's voice, Graves's expectations, Graves's endless counting of her worth, finally dissolved into nothing. She slept. And on the balcony beyond the window, Valerius remained motionless, his coat drinking the dawn, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was rising over a city that would never touch her again.